Welcome back to Time Travelers. Today, we're uncovering the suspenseful story of George, a young World War II pilot who embarks on a daring mission to destroy a Japanese radio tower on Chichijima. Shot down and stranded in the ocean, George's struggle for survival is only part of the tale. We'll also reveal the shocking and horrifying fate of his fellow airmen, captured and cannibalized by Japanese officers. Don't miss this gripping story of bravery and brutality. For years, the U.S. Navy obscured the horrifying truth of what happened at Chichijima. One lawyer involved in the episode remarked, "The Navy didn't want people back home to know that their sons were eaten." As for the survivor, the sole man to escape the awful fate of the Chichijima incident was a 20-year-old pilot. His name was George. The U.S. Navy had had its eye on the island of Chichijima for quite some time. Chichijima was tiny, only about twice the size of Central Park, but strategically significant. About 500 miles from Japan, its radio tower allowed the Japanese to send long-range messages. The Americans wanted to take it out. In June 1944, American aircraft carriers surrounded Chichijima and started sending pilots to destroy the radio tower. But the Japanese put up a ferocious fight. Chichijima was guarded by 25,000 Japanese troops, and its anti-aircraft defense system could tear the American planes to pieces. On September 2, 1944, the Americans geared up to try again. The group of men slated to fly that morning included one of the youngest pilots in the U.S. Navy, a 20-year-old named George. They took off at 7:15 a.m., hoping this time to succeed in taking out Chichijima's radio tower, but it didn't take long for the Japanese to fight back. The island's anti-aircraft defense system fired into the sky. About an hour into the mission, Bush realized that his plane had been hit. The plane was burning, George later recalled. The cockpit was beginning to fill up with smoke. The plane I thought it was going to explode. In spite of this, George continued flying. He dropped 2 bombs on the radio tower and then pulled the plane back toward the open ocean. George ordered his radio operator and gunner to jump. "Hit the silk," he commanded, but only he escaped. George watched in horror as their plane crashed into the ocean. He floated down onto the waves, alone. "For a while there, I thought I was done," George later said. Instead, he escaped the fate of 8 other pilots that day. The horrific Chichijima incident. Like George, a number of the other American pilots were forced to abandon their planes and land on the water. Unlike George, they were immediately captured by the Japanese. Brought to the island of Chichijima, the airmen were tortured, beaten, and executed. In one particularly gruesome moment, a radio operator was marched to a freshly dug grave, blindfolded and beheaded with a sword. Others were killed with sharpened bamboo spears. One was even clubbed to death. But the real horror of the Chichijima incident didn't start until the men were dead. Shortly after one of the prisoners had been executed, Japanese General Yoshio Tachibana made a drunken suggestion to dig up his body and use it as meat. Tachibana insisted that everyone show they had enough fighting spirit to eat human flesh. As a result, surgeons removed the liver and thigh muscles of the soldiers, which cooks then presented to the Japanese officers with soy sauce and vegetables, alongside hot sake. Admiral Kenizo Mori later testified that a chef had the liver pierced with bamboo sticks and cooked with soy sauce and vegetables. The dish was apparently a delicacy, and according to Mori was believed to be good for the stomach. Major Sueo Matoba, who was among the senior officers who cannibalized the American soldiers, later defended his actions. "We were hungry. I hardly know what happened after that. We really were not cannibals." As his fellow soldiers were plucked from the ocean and brought to Chichijima, George fought for his life in the middle of the sea. Japanese boats circled nearby, hoping to capture him, but fire from the American planes above drove them back. "I was crying, throwing up and swimming like hell," George later recalled. "I could have made the Olympics that day because we had to get out of there." He thought he'd gone mad when a submarine suddenly breached the waves in front of him. "I saw this thing coming out of the water and I said to myself, geez, I hope it's one of ours," George remembered. George's lucky streak had continued. The submarine was the USS Finback. After he was pulled from the ocean, the exhausted future president uttered just 4 words: "Happy to be aboard." George's side of the story is well known, but what happened to his fellow airmen long remained a secret. Although the Japanese officers responsible for the Chichijima incident later admitted their actions at war crime trials in Guam, the American soldiers' families didn't know what had happened to their sons. Concerned that a true account would inflict further trauma on already grieving families, the U.S. decided to label the files recounting the soldiers' last days as top secret. In fact, the heart-wrenching truth of their deaths did not come out until James Bradley published his 2003 book, Flyboys: A True Story of Courage. Then, the public learned what had become of the pilots and how narrowly an American president had avoided a similar fate. As for George H.W. Bush, the 41st president and sole survivor, even Bush didn't know about the Chichijima incident. He learned about it in 2003 when Bradley was writing his book. "There was a lot of head shaking, a lot of silence," Bradley said. said, about Bush's reaction. There was no disgust, shock, or horror. He's a veteran of a different generation. Still, Bush's brush with death, and perhaps worse, conjures a web of hypotheticals for the former president. Prior to his death in 2018, Bush mused about what-ifs during an interview with CNN. "I wonder if I could have done something different," he said. "Why me? Why am I blessed? Why am I still alive?"